Welcome to the Isle of Man Financial Intelligence Unit's first ever webinar. I'm Holly Croydon, one of the intelligence officers here at the FIU. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, I'm Ian McMillan, I'm the Operations Manager.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Rattigan. I'm an advocate dealing with financial crime and international cooperation, and I spend 2 days a week here at the FIU.
I'm Dave Baker. I'm the IT lead and financial intelligence officer at the FIU.
Today we are hopefully going to be answering any questions you have about making suspicious activity reports and other disclosures to the FIU. But before we start the questions, we have some general housekeeping. You should be able to see the chat option on your screen. Here you can send us your own questions and we'll do our best to answer them live. If we can't answer them live, we'll endeavour to do so offline after the webinar. It should also be noted that this webinar is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. Let's begin. One of the first questions we've had is, what is the difference between making a SAR under the Proceeds of Crime Act or a disclosure under the FIU Act?
Okay, so I think the simple answer to that one is that if you have a knowledge or a suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing, you have a legal obligation to make a SAR as prescribed under the Proceeds of Crime Act or the Anti-Terrorism and Crime Act. In the Isle of Man, I'm going to concentrate on the Proceeds of Crime Act because generally that's what we're dealing with in most situations that we deal with where there's a situation giving rise to a suspicion or knowledge of money laundering. And only by submitting a SAR under POCA can you request consent to carry out a prohibited act. So that's a very important distinction. You're effectively asking the FIU to provide you with a defence against the criminal offences of money laundering under the Act. Making a disclosure under Section 24 is a little bit different. And one way of looking at it is that it's when we're looking for something from you rather than you're asking us to do something. It's not a case where you can make a consent request, as I've touched on. The FIU aims to collect as much quality intelligence as possible to be as effective as possible in helping to prevent and detect crime, and not only financial crime, but any crime. And Section 24 of the FIU Act allows anyone to give us information that they think might be relevant to the FIU for that purpose of protecting and detecting and preventing crime. So for the regulated sector, there's a document on Themis. I think it's under the tab which is called Guidance and Legislation for MLROs. It's called Typologies and it's dated May 2018. And this gives some good examples of situations where it may be that you don't feel you have a suspicion or knowledge of money laundering, you don't need to submit a SAR, but you do want to tell us something. And one of the examples given in this is a scenario in which an MLRO becomes aware that a long-standing wealthy foreign client with legitimate sources of wealth has then become the subject of a corruption investigation in their home country. The situation sort of explains that it would be where the alleged offences occurred after the client relationship began, and there's no suspicion regarding the funds which were initially introduced into the Isle of Man and were the subject of the business relationship here. But obviously with that additional information of the offences that have potentially happened later, the MLRO feels that the FIU might be interested to know that kind of information. And although that's sort of a fairly high level, quite exciting example of grand corruption, it's not really difficult to imagine a lot of scenarios in a more day-to-day situation where the regulated sector might experience that sort of situation where the initial source of wealth is checked out, but later situations cause concern about the client in other ways. And as I've said, although the focus is obviously for us on financial crime and financial intelligence, we are interested in dealing with any crimes that you may come to have knowledge of.
Brilliant. The second question we have is, I often hear the FIU doesn't investigate crime. What is it that you do if it's not investigating crime?
Yeah, so it's probably helpful to go back a few years. The FIU came into existence in 2016 as a body corporate under the FIU Act. However, there was an FIU function in the Isle of Man for many, many years, and it sat inside the financial crime unit, which was part of the Isle of Man Constabulary. The financial crime unit, as well as having an FIU function, also supported the Attorney Generals in respect of international cooperation inquiries and undertook financial crime investigations. In 2016, when the Act came into force and we had a full split of responsibilities, it's understandable that we continue to get a lot of contact from industry and the public trying to report crimes, financial crimes in particular. And it's probably a fault that sat with ourselves, but in trying to explain to people that we don't undertake statement taking, gathering of evidence, executing warrants, submission of production orders, arresting suspects, preparing prosecution files. It was just used, instead of going through all of that, it was just explained to them, we don't conduct financial crime investigations in those terms. But I think it's fair to say both industry and the public probably think that's what a financial crime investigation is, and they're right. However, our responsibilities are very broad. Our general functions are described under Section 5 of the FIU Act, and it covers a real range of pieces of work. It starts from the receipt, the gathering, the analysis of intelligence, and it goes all the way through to supporting law enforcement agencies, both in the island and further afield globally. And we do all of those different functions, we undertake them. In terms of do we conduct investigations? Yes, we investigate the nature of the information that's given, we seek to analyse it, we reach out to partners in other jurisdictions and in agencies within the Isle of Man, we engage with industry, we use our powers to collect and analyse more information. So I suppose in terms of a dictionary definition, yes, we do investigate. And it's been quite a while now since I've been asked by industry if you're not investigating what you're doing. However, I have recently had a member of the public who historically dealt with the FCU coming on to us and asking us to undertake a financial crime investigation where it really was a police function. So it still exists, the misnomer and the misunderstanding out there.
Okay. Third question we've had is, how much detail do I need to put in a suspicious activity report?
I mean, if you imagine we get over 2,000 disclosures or suspicious activity reports through Themis every year, there's a whole different amount of information we get on each one of those. And the best ones we've found are the ones that generally tell a story. We need enough information that somebody coming and reading that disclosure can understand what the suspicion is of the submitter, of the MLRO that's submitting it, as well as everything that you have to tell us. So under the prescribed disclosures regulation, I think it's 2015, we can put a link alongside this webinar, that tells the MLRO exactly what they have to tell us. So there's certain things about subjects, there we go, thank you, Elizabeth. The stuff that they have to tell us, the name, subjects, transaction information, the list is all there ready to go. But it's about a story and about why that MLRO, that person, believes that they are looking at the process of crime, why they think that there's a money laundering offence, why they think a financing terror event is occurring. And unless we see the whole story, 2 or 3 lines just really isn't enough. I know, certainly speaking to the staff, they want to be able to read a descriptive story about what's happened, not 2 or 3 lines. Otherwise, we end up having the communication back and forth to try and get the information that we require.
Thank you. Question 4, we've been granted business as usual consent in the past. Why isn't this available anymore?
Right. Probably 2 years ago now, due to an emerging set of circumstances, particularly within the large retail banks, we took a look at our practices around issuing consent under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and we drew up an agreement in terms of what we would need in order to give a what the banks termed a business as usual consent. Recently, as usual, as everybody should do, we conducted a review of our practices, and it's quite apparent that there's really not the sort of protection in giving a business as usual consent to the requesting institution that they should reasonably be asking for. Therefore, we issued guidance recently which touches upon a number of areas where we are willing to give consent, but it has to be far more detailed in terms of what the transaction or a series of transactions are and what the conduct is that they're seeking consent for. Now, as Elizabeth touched upon, it has to be in respect of a suspected proceeds of crime offence. It can't be attached to a Section 24 request, and it's suggested within the guidance it may help the requester to lay it all out on a table. And if it was, for example, the maintenance of a business relationship where there's expected rolling expenses, payments, whether that's, for example, a mortgage, insurances, maintenance of a property, we would be happy to consider that in those terms. But there is also a requirement within the order that Dave touched upon that a clear narrative has to be given as to what is being requested, and that's why we look to a table or a matrix, and it has subsequently worked really well. And I think the benefit of hindsight, that was the route we should have gone down.
Thank you. Question 5. What information must I submit when I make a request for consent to make a transaction or enter into an arrangement?
So it really is building on what Dave was saying about us looking for a good quality SAR and hopefully a strong sort of narrative that explains to us that from the start to the finish what the circumstances are that have given rise to the suspicion, and then following on from there sort of the necessary details. When we're dealing with a request for consent, there's obviously another layer that needs to be added to the narrative, because we need enough information to know what it is that's proposed to be done, the transaction or the arrangement, and we need enough information that so that we can meaningfully decide whether or not it's appropriate to give consent in the circumstances. And I think it's a really good question, because I think it's for everybody in here and also for most people in the regulated sector, I'm sure, that we've all experienced the real sort of time pressure and time constraints that the Isle of Man's consent regime involving the notice period and the moratorium period, I mean, that can put both us and our industry partners under considerable time pressure, and it is an issue that we come across fairly regularly. So that was one of our aims in updating the SARs guidance and issuing that very recently. The hope is that we can avoid or at least improve upon the kind of circumstances, and not just for ourselves, obviously for everyone, just to make the whole thing a little bit less of a pressurised situation. We absolutely understand that there are always going to be some sort of very urgent circumstances or some very complex or complicated issues, and there will be time pressure. We can't do away with that altogether. It's the nature of the beast. But in submitting a real high quality SAR, the hope is that we all know what we're dealing with from the outset, and it just makes for a better experience for everybody involved. So as Dave touched on, the basic requirements for the SAR are set out in the prescribed disclosures order 2015. I think that there is a link to that within the SARs guidance on the website, and that's it is pretty basic, but it's useful as a checklist, I guess. When we're talking about a consent request, the extra layers of information that we'd like to see in the narrative really centre on 3 areas. So we'd like some really good information about the basis for the suspicion or the knowledge, and again, that's sort of part of this storytelling aspect that Dave's spoken about. Just some good detail on what it is that's made you feel uncomfortable and have a suspicion of money laundering. Then obviously a really important part is to have a good description, a good detailed description of the property that we're talking about, the subject of the transaction or the arrangement that's proposed to be entered into or that has been entered into. So it could be obviously funds or investments, other assets, but a real as full a description as possible of that. And then following on from that, an important factor, obviously all the available details in relation to the transaction or the arrangement itself, because the whole point of the consent request is obviously for us to be able to meaningfully analyse that information and hopefully provide a defence against money laundering. And in order to do that, we need to know the ins and outs of what it is that's proposed to go on. So things like the amounts and the valuations of the assets or the property that we're dealing with. Obviously, sources and destinations is a big one. And then the nitty-gritty things that go with that, so bank details, beneficiary names, addresses, all that sort of thing, just as full a picture as possible. And that just means that we can analyse it as soon as possible, get you the consent that you're asking for, hopefully, and be able to do that in a meaningful way and know that we're all protected as much as we can be under the legislation.
Thank you. One of the questions we've had in is, would there not be suspicion that the fees the company is receiving may be tainted, even though the funds initially introduced are not suspicious?
Okay, so I think this is following on from the question that we were talking about earlier about the difference between a SAR under POCA or ACCA or a Section 24, and the example that I gave then was where the initial funds that had been put into the client relationship on the Isle of Man were believed to be legitimate, and there was no suspicion surrounding them, but then that later circumstances had caused some sort of concern about the client's behaviour or possible offending, which was not particularly related to money laundering. Obviously, you would have to assess that situation as it evolved. So I was very specifically referring to the initial source of wealth. Obviously, then once you become aware that there is some other concern about a client, you've got to assess that as it continues to come in. You've got to keep looking at the situation and the money. And obviously, if it becomes appropriate, it's perfectly feasible that in the past, although you've had this long-standing client relationship, there has been no need to submit a SAR, there's been no suspicion. But then, unfortunately, all of a sudden, circumstances are different, the money's coming from a different source, something like that, and that is the thing that triggers you then to have a suspicion. But what I was talking about earlier would be situations where a suspicion of money laundering doesn't arise at all, and that's when you would look at using Section 24. So an example, I don't know, sort of fairly extreme example, but maybe a good one would be, you could have a client from, say, one of the retail banks, and they had a regular income coming in, it looked like wages being paid in from an established company, and that had been going on for years, and then maybe it turns out that, I don't know, they take a rush of blood to the head one day and murder their spouse. It's perfectly feasible that you, as a retail bank, could then get information about their whereabouts. They could use their debit card or whatever it is. That's information that we would like to know. Again, the FIU Act specifically says that we can be interested in all types of crime, not just financial crime. So again, it's quite an extreme example, but it's not always, it doesn't always have to be exclusively money laundering.
And within Themis, you can always ask us to submit further information to upgrade, so to speak, the disclosure to a suspicious activity report, or if you look for the subject within Themis, you can click on the little green tick and just add another disclosure, and you can then add a Process of Crime Act disclosure if you think it's appropriate now to change to add your suspicion to what was originally a non-suspicion event.
Brilliant. So another question we've had is, please could you confirm what the status is relating to the existing cases, clients where BAU has already been granted? Can a business continue under the business as usual consent?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a natural progression to the earlier question. And a really straightforward answer is, once we have granted consent, there is no provision to rescind it, to change our mind. We can't be saying to industry, yes, you have consent to undertake this act, engage in this transaction, and then suddenly change our mind a week later, a month later. So if we have issued consent in any circumstances, that stands. And there is, however, an expectation that, more broadly, that all relationships continue to be reviewed. That's normal. It's covered by the MLCTF codes from the FSA and the equivalent codes from the Gambling Supervision Commission. And if what was once a business as usual consent, the circumstances materially change, we would expect to be told of that. And if there's a transaction attached to it, we would be expecting that the regulated industry would be seeking further consent in order to have a defence to money laundering under POCA.
Okay. So another question we've got is, if I'm making a SAR to another jurisdiction, do as well as one to the Isle of Man FIU, do I need to tell you?
In short, yes. However, as ever, and this is becoming more and more common as a number of regulated industries have their financial crime function remote. Some have multiple jurisdictions and the financial crime function sits within the Isle of Man. Others, it sits elsewhere. It's permissible under the codes. One of the problems that occurs, and we are not alone, for example, the UK legislation is very similar, is if the person who forms the suspicion is physically sat in the Isle of Man, then under the Proceeds of Crime Act, they're obliged to report it. However, we do recognise that the subject about whom the report is being made may be in a third jurisdiction, never mind in a further jurisdiction. The business relationship may be in a further jurisdiction. If it's a company, it may be owned in another jurisdiction. So in actual terms of a nexus within the Isle of Man, it is nothing more than the person that's physically sat here when they form that suspicion. Now, when those circumstances occur, and they are becoming more frequent, we're really keen to engage with that particular member of regulated industry and come to an agreement of how best to report. There is an obligation under POCA, but we're equally cognizant that we do not want to put an unnecessary burden upon industry. We do, however, have to be satisfied that it has been reported correctly to the second jurisdiction, and that, certainly in the last 18 months, 2 years, has become a rolling programme now of engagement as different bits of regulated industry find themselves in that situation.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and on that, if someone does make a report to another jurisdiction, it's really important on them is to actually report, tell us that that's occurred, because that'll give us a good idea of what then we need to do with that. If we get a bit of information about a German subject, for instance, that comes through, and there's no suggestion that it's been reported to the German FIU under, say, a gambling licence, then we might feel obliged to tell Germany about that subject, or we might be happy that it's been dual reported and there's no further action that needs to be taken from our side.
Thank you very much. We've got another question here. Do I need to include a subject in my SAR even if I have no suspicion of them?
If it forms part of the story, I would say. So a good example is we have a victim of fraud and we get a disclosure in and the subject of the offender is named, all the details are on there, but the other side of the transaction, the victim, we don't have that information. That information can be really important to help us with our typologies. It might be really important to be able to see if there are other victims or if that person has been the victim of multiple frauds and that one fraud is just one bank account's bit of information. It might be that we have ways of contacting that person through law enforcement to make sure that the necessary support mechanisms are there. So if it's part of the story, then yes. If it's a nominee director of a nominee company that's part of the regulated member that's sending it, then possibly not necessarily. It depends if it fits the story.
Okay. How long would a SAR take before a prosecution?
The genuine answer to that is how long is a piece of string? It can take years if you think, especially dealing in a sort of an international financial centre as we are. you can be dealing with a SAR, which could be the absolute tip of the iceberg, and underneath it there could be a whole great big structure of other jurisdictions, companies, trusts, multiple suspects, multiple subjects, multiple victims. These things can take years to unravel. There's no easy answer to that. It's unfortunate, and we understand that it can be quite frustrating to feel that you're firing this information off into the ether and nothing's being done with it. And I can absolutely assure you that that's not the case. The information is all processed properly. It's a really valuable part of the whole effort, which hopefully ends in a prosecution. And sometimes it does. And very often, dealing with the Isle of Man situation, that prosecution could occur somewhere else in the world. And again, we might never really get to know about that, but we could have been a really important cog in a bigger wheel. So, hopefully, sometimes there's a good news story. A lot of the time there could be good news and we just don't get to hear of it, which is frustrating.
No SAR that we receive isn't read by human beings, which is a big thing. So everything that's submitted to us is read. It's just, as Elizabeth said, it's hard to see where they go sometimes.
I think the other thing that needs to be taken into consideration is that about 75% of our disseminations arising from information which industry have given us are only international, and in many jurisdictions things move really slowly, and it's a matter of public record, newspaper articles. Justice in some jurisdictions takes considerably longer than possibly we are used to and we would really like. And we know from our engagement with Isle of Man law enforcement agencies and our immediate neighbour in the UK and the other Crown dependencies that international letters of request seeking evidence from other jurisdictions, it's frequently measured in years, not months, whereas I know the Isle of Man has a remarkable turnaround when information comes into Elizabeth's department. The speed at which it's turned around is, I think it's arguable, probably in the top 5 in the world in how quickly, and it has been commented upon favourably at evaluation how quick we are, but our law enforcement can't force issues in other countries and other jurisdictions. So the information that somebody in Isle of Man's provided about a suspected Isle of Man offence may rely greatly on a foreign jurisdiction, and they do not move as quickly as we do.
Okay. Can you explain the threshold amount that we can request?
Yeah, threshold amounts probably sit quite naturally with the previous practice of business as usual. The threshold amount is set. Presently it's £250. That's been £250 for as long as I can remember, and is realistically far too small a sum where there is a wish, and sometimes it suits the investigative function as well, that the relationship with a client continues whilst an investigation is undertaken either by the reporting entity or by the FIU or a law enforcement agency. Therefore, we would encourage industry where they feel that it's appropriate to maintain the relationship until some decisions are taken. If they feel the threshold amount is too little, there is part of pocket which allows us to vary it on their behalf, and we're happy to do so. But we need to just understand why.
Important to know that it's for deposit-taking institutions only.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question we've got is, which crimes other than money laundering and finance terrorism should be disclosed to the FIU? Which kind of fraud should or should not be reported to the FIU? 2 questions in one there.
The general functions which I mentioned right at the beginning in terms of why the FIU exists are really broad. So yes, we do have an interest in crime, not just financial crime. However, POCA is designed to report suspicions of money laundering, and likewise ATCA for suspicions of terrorism financing, and where appropriate to seek a consent to have a defence in law to proposed conduct. Therefore, that's really the only basis in which to report under POCA or ATCA is in respect of money laundering or terrorism financing. Where frauds have occurred and the victim is in the Isle of Man and there's no reason to think that the offender is in the Isle of Man, i.e. they're out with our jurisdiction, the practice is to report to action fraud. Action fraud is a police-driven function in the UK, for which the Isle of Man and the other Crown dependencies are also members. Action fraud collates all reports of fraud. It undertakes analysis, it looks for commonality, it seeks to identify where offenders may be, and then it creates packages and they're sent to the police force where the offender is believed to reside. The nature of the community in the Isle of Man, unfortunately, we have far more victims than we do suspected offenders, although we have had referrals from action fraud about local suspects, but by far and away the bulk are, unfortunately, we have victims. So we encourage both through dealing with institutions, financial institutions, but also the public, where they're the victim of fraud and it's occurred, that they go to action fraud to report it, and that's the constabulary's line as well. Where it has just occurred, and we can't make promises because it is the banks that move money. We don't move money. We can't get into bank accounts to stop funds. But if it's occurred within minutes, we may be able to assist. We'll certainly try and assist in stopping the funds moving through the local clearing banks. But unfortunately, if much more than a few minutes have passed, then the money will have moved several times. It will have been split several times to different jurisdictions that are in different accounts.
And if it's not a money laundering or finance of terrorism crime, they can submit under Section 24.
Yes, if they think it's something which we as an FIU would not just like to know about, it fits inside our general functions. As I said earlier, they're really broad. So early on when the FIU Act came in, and I was trying to explain that the use of Section 24, the best description I could give was we rely on industry's expert knowledge. And, each sector is specialists in their own core business. And if they're looking at a particular relationship, conduct, transactions, and they know are confident it's not money laundering, it's not terrorism financing, but equally with their experience, and it is vast, they know it's not right. That's the sort of thing we want to know about. It doesn't have to be nailed on that, for example, well, I know this is fraud. All it needs to be is, I know it's not right, and we'd be keen to hear.
Hopefully that covers it. Another question we've got is, why does the panel think they get so few SARs from TCSPs and other non-banking organisations?
I think you've got to look at the number of transactions for starters. So if you look at the really large volumes submitters that come to us, virtual currency, e-gaming, retail banking, far more transactions are occurring in those businesses. So they will, by default, have a higher volume of disclosures. But when we're looking at quality disclosures, ones from TCSPs and retail banks as well, that I think we get much higher quality, more descriptive, more interesting disclosure, perhaps, from those ones. So it's not always about volume or quantity. Quality is a big part of that as well.
I think on a similar topic, it's a theme. This is not a particular Isle of Man centric theme of the suggestion of less reporting or under-reporting in certain sectors is common, not just in Western Europe, it's common across the world. There is, probably suspicion is the wrong word, there's a thought that certain sectors under-report, and they consistently under-report. So we are aware of it, and we do prior to COVID, we had a series of sector outreach workshops, many of them informal, which we're always pleased to attend. The invitations are welcome, and we do, where we get a chance to speak to particular sectors where there's a broad concern around underreporting, we do raise it with them, and it is a question we just put straight to them, is have you considered your extent of reporting? Have you got it right? And it's not something we know, because we don't see the internal, the unusual activity reports, which are considered by the MLRO prior to externalising to ourselves. So we're unsighted on that, and it really is, it's a judgment call within each of the sectors and each piece of industry.
Thank you. Any data on the number of criminal prosecutions that have happened after a SAR, domestic or internationally?
I don't have that information at my fingertips, I'm afraid. It's certainly something that we can look into. The government, across government, there's a big project which is ongoing and has been for some time now, to sort of coordinate statistics, particularly in relation to financial crime and to the island's response to AML-CFT, international standards, that kind of thing. So this is certainly the sort of information that we're aiming to capture much more efficiently now and in the future than has previously been the case, quite frankly. So it is underway, and I can look into that, and hopefully we can get some information out to people at a later point. The international ones, and I'm possibly sort of slightly repeating myself here, but it is a good point, because we do get a lot of international SARs, and there is a question about what happens to them. As Dave said, they are all read, they are all processed from here. What happens to the information that we then disseminate as a result of that? We just have no control over. And I think, not to make excuses for people, but I think it is a valid point that, that information can sometimes be at a very early stage in a massive international complex investigation. And although we routinely ask for feedback both from the FIU and sort of at a later stage when I'm involved in evidence gathering for the jurisdictions, when we provide them with that evidence or with the intelligence in the first place, we do request feedback about how useful that information or intelligence or evidence has been. They don't always get back to us, and I think it's understandable, because if you think of the sort of the massive machine that they're trying to keep control of and operate in order to get to the end point, to get to a successful prosecution, the last thing that they've got time to do at the end of it is to think, I must let the Isle of Man know how useful that was. It would be great in a perfect world, but there are very good reasons why it doesn't happen. So sometimes, the nice outcome can be, you'd be sitting reading the national papers one day, and a name comes up that you're familiar with, and hey ho, there has been a successful prosecution in wherever it is, and that's a nice feeling, and we'll sort of take a clipping and put that on the file and consider it a success story. But we completely understand why, the feedback's not always as forthcoming as we would like.
If someone's been a criminal here, they'll be a criminal in a lot of other places. And I think there's probably SAR, if we're seeing a SAR come in on somebody for the Isle of Man, lots of other jurisdictions will be contributing to that investigation. And whether it's that one special activity report that started it, we just won't know, sadly.
Thank you. Another question we have is, if you became aware of a client with assets in the Isle of Man under management by a CSP was being investigated by their home jurisdiction, should we notify the Isle of Man FIU by SAR or written correspondence?
There's quite a few options within that question. I'll try and be brief, but chuck in if you get additional thoughts. If an Isle of Man regulated industry becomes aware that one of their clients who has assets in the Isle of Man being managed, as it says, by CSP, and they are being investigated in their home jurisdiction, which I'm presuming from the question is not the Isle of Man, then I would firstly expect them to treat that as a trigger or a red flag event and conduct an internal review and consider, with the benefit of that information, is this client of a concern? Do they have a suspicion around money laundering using the Isle of Man financial vehicle? If there is, then we expect there to be a POCA SAR. Hopefully not. an ATCA under TF, but it does occur. And if they're not suspicious, having conducted the review under the red flag, yes, we would expect them to provide us with a disclosure under Section 24, bringing this to our attention. Because if this is somebody, or whether a natural or a legal person, if they have a structure in the Isle of Man and they're not resident here, there's a fair chance they're going to have other structures, possibly with other CSPs that the first one doesn't know about. And we may already have quite a bit of interest in them, or we may be able to assist the other jurisdiction in furtherance of their criminal investigation.
Last question. Are there any plans along the lines of agencies such as the NCA and their strategy of dare to share intelligence with businesses?
Yes. Next. It's a really good question. It's something we are really keen to further engage in. There are certain bits of the UK model that have merit. There is, it must be now entering its 5th years, I think, called law enforcement and business partnership called GIMLET, which the NCA administer, but it's very much about industry being keen to assist in investigations, and it's targeted, it's focused on certain sectors. We've been fortunate to be allowed to be observers at a couple of GIMLET meetings in the UK, obviously prior to COVID, and it's something we would like to look at in the Isle of Man. The members of GIMLET from industry submit themselves to sort of fairly heavy scrutiny in terms of their vetting, so that the NCA and the other law enforcement agencies, I think in the UK it's 42 police forces, then there's the Police Scotland, there's PSNI in Northern Ireland, so England and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, there's a lot of police agencies, but there's also additional agencies that don't really come to the fore very often, but they still investigate crime, and they're also members of GIMLET, and they share some quite sensitive material. So the dare to share is a great expression, and historically law enforcement, FIUs, have been quite nervous about it. I think GIMLET's been very successful. It's something we'd be keen to explore further in the island.
On a lower level, I think with Section 18s, we are trying to share a lot more information when we send out our requests for information.
Yeah.
So it's paid to be more of a story for the receiver.
Brilliant. So as we said before, if we haven't answered your questions, we'll get back to them after the webinar. But thank you for joining our webinar. Don't forget to check us out on LinkedIn and Twitter. And please, when this finishes, complete the evaluation form to give us feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.